Celine for inviting me to speak here this evening, and to all of you for coming out to listen. And I was asked to tell you a little bit about my book and how it came about, so I'll begin with that. And I should probably put in that my PhD was actually in English, so I had a sort of a literature approach and a literary approach to undertaking this topic, so just to put that in there. Anyway, you will remember from your childhood that there were different categories of sin, venial and mortal. So sins were graded in terms of their seriousness and, of course, the intent of the sinner. So when it came to penalties for those sins, they too were categorized. Penitential books were compiled in the early Middle Ages, and they contained instructions for confessors about how to judge the various sins and what penalties to impose. They included questions to ask the penitents to assess the seriousness of the sin, and the books included long lists of sins and what penances to prescribe. And these books, you might be interested to know, originated in the monasteries of Ireland and were compiled by Irish abbots, with the earliest dating from the 6th century. And of course, Irish monks were central to the propagation of the gospel in Europe, so their work was very influential. So this grading of sin is where it all began for me, and it all began in 2010, as Colin said. In that year, I came across a small piece in a newspaper, almost accidentally, and it said that the Vatican had upgraded the sin of ordaining women. Yes, upgraded. I was really struck by that word. So it was a sin to ordain a woman as a priest, which was forbidden in any case, but now the Vatican was going to make it an even bigger sin. Why did they feel the need to do this? What was going on? And just to put some context on it, at the time, the Vatican was involved in putting out fires all over the world in relation to the child abuse scandals. So I wondered, what was I supposed to think about the Vatican concerning themselves with something that apparently can't happen, women being ordained, instead of concerning themselves with something that was happening, namely the child abuse scandals, which I might add continue to unfold. And the article also said that to upgrade a sin meant changing the Church's code of penal law. And this, I discovered later, is a rare occurrence, which suggested that the upgrading of this sin was a very serious matter indeed. But why concentrate on this issue, which is forbidden in any case, when there was so much the Vatican could have been concentrating on? What was I, or indeed anyone else, supposed to think about this? And I wondered, what did it tell us about the Vatican's thoughts on women? Well, it seemed fairly clear that the Vatican was very keen to make sure that any woman who might have been wondering about why she couldn't be on the altar would be in no doubt about the fact that she couldn't. And as we already knew that the Catholic Church is absolutely sure that women were never to feature in any official capacity, I wondered, why the upgrade? Why redo something that you've already done? So in my case, this move by the Vatican, carried out, to use John Paul II's phrase, in order that all doubt be removed, actually had the opposite effect on me. Those were the thoughts that were running around in my head. But there was nowhere to go with this, no one to talk to about it, no one to explain it. I thought that if I asked a priest, I'd probably get the party line, so to speak. And if there were lay people who'd know, I didn't know where to find them, outside of a theology college, that is. Besides, I wanted objective, reasoned arguments, and I realised that I'd have to find the answers for myself. So that's how it all started. And when I did begin to look into it, I discovered that many others had doubts too. And the topic had arisen again and again, especially since the 1960s. So much so that John Paul II went to great lengths to quash any dissent. But if you have to keep coming up with additions to your arguments, as the Vatican has done since the 1960s, well, maybe it's not so clear-cut after all. So the first questions to consider was, did Jesus really make it clear that no woman should ever have a role in his movement, ever? The problem was that I didn't know much about women in the Bible. Besides Our Lady and the odd mention of Mary Magdalene, women in the Bible barely featured in my exposure to Catholicism while I was growing up. And besides, Our Lady was way above any ordinary woman's reach, and no good Catholic girl wanted to be Mary Magdalene. So poor Mary Magdalene, we were seriously misinformed about her. I tried to recall what I'd heard about women and Christianity, besides the usual cliched list of duties and expectations, and realised that I'd have to start from scratch. So I began to look for material. I came across the work of Mary T. Malone, who'd written 3 books on women and Christianity, and these were quite literally a godsend. And as I began to read her work, and then read about the women who had accompanied Jesus and the women of the early church, I wondered, how had I missed them? Why had I not noticed that they were there? Well, it's because the Christian story has always been presented through the male perspective. The Gospels were written by men, about the doings of men, and for a male audience. They were then interpreted by men and taught by men. The focus, therefore, has always been on what the men are doing. And this means that Christian women are not highly visible. Their thoughts, teachings, and indeed their presence in the Christian story is largely overlooked, and certainly not transmitted by the men of the church. But when I looked at the Bible, I saw that women were there. Did you know, for example, that one scholar has identified over 60 women in the New Testament? And why is it that women who want to contribute within their own faith system are seen as a problem? Is it in fact the men of the church that have an issue with women and not Jesus or God? And if so, what do the men of the official church really think about women? So I began to look at the arguments used by the Vatican to justify the exclusion of women from ministry in the Catholic Church. And I wondered, were they good arguments? Were they reasonable arguments? Would they stand up to scrutiny? And did the reasons really reflect what was in the Bible? And just to remind you, the reasons given by the Vatican as to why women cannot be ordained are as follows. Jesus chose only male apostles. The church has always imitated this practice, and the church teaches that the exclusion of women from the priesthood is in accordance with God's plan for his church. The second and third reasons, in my view, are simply justifications used to support the first reason. In other words, reasons 2 and 3 simply state that the church has always followed this particular interpretation of Jesus' actions in choosing men, and believes that not having women in ministry is not only the will of God, but also his deliberate plan. So the first reason was the one to investigate. Was the gender of Jesus' chosen disciples to be the most important aspect of ministry? But I did wonder too, did that particular choice apply to the first century, or was it to apply for all time? After all, the practice of having 12 specific apostles was not carried on by Paul, Peter, or James. What I did, therefore, was to look especially at Jesus' interactions with women in the Bible, how he spoke to them, healed them, and indeed defended them during his mission. I saw that women were among his followers, that they witnessed his death and resurrection, and that women were very much part of the early Christian communities established by St. Paul. So I began to see a very different story to the one I had accepted from childhood. I also saw in the writings and deliberations of the men of the church, or church fathers as they are known, that women were in fact misrepresented in the Christian story, in their writings, especially in cases where women's presence presented a contradiction to what were then accepted beliefs about women's inferiority. And Mary Magdalene is the obvious example here. So I traced women's journey through the story of Christianity from the time of Jesus and St. Paul, through the expansion of the newly emerging religion in the Roman Empire, through its travails in the Middle Ages and the influence of Thomas Aquinas, and through the teachings of various popes. Women's demise, and indeed their exclusion, was in fact a later development in the church, as synods and councils, one after the other, banned women from leadership roles in the church. But of course, if you're banning something, it's because it's happening. So women were ministering in the early church. The move in 2010 by Pope Benedict to make the ordination of women a really serious sin was a determined effort to make sure that there would be no women in ministry again. And the cessation of the Vatican Commission studying the issue of women serving as deacons in the Catholic Church further upholds women's exclusion. So I traced the story of women's demise from the time of Jesus to the modern day, and I examined the arguments used, particularly from the 1960s onwards, to justify the prohibition against women holding any official role in their own church. What I also considered was what those arguments, edicts, judgments, and so on tell us about the mindset of the men in the Vatican. And that, I feel, is something women should know about. And it's no harm if men know about it too. But all of that you can read in the book for yourselves. And you may or may not, of course, agree with my findings, but my wish for those of you who read my book is that you read it with an open mind and think about it. So to move on a little bit, because nothing stands still, where are we now with the topic of women and ministry in the Catholic Church? In the revised edition of The Elephant in the Church, Mary T. Malone says that she no longer believes that the Church is capable of the kind of meaningful structural reform that could restore women to the place Christ intended for them. I think she's right. The Vatican, in my view, is no way open to changing their perspective on women. And that poses the next question. Is there even any point in talking about women and the Catholic Church? There has been no change and no sign of change. And just look at the diaconate situation. And for younger women who now take their place in the world without even thinking about it, an organisation that doesn't want them, or what's to even think about, besides just leaving them to it. Because, as Mary T. Malone has pointed out, while women's status in the church has not changed, outside the official church, female Christians are changing. Because here's the thing, people do have questions, people do have doubts. They wonder about God, about Jesus, about religion, and especially about the church. We learn by asking questions. So why has the church taken such extreme measures to silence those who question its teachings rather than simply addressing the questions? An organisation or body or institute has to accept and welcome challenges if it is to be viable and progressive. The Catholic Church has taken the opposite view. It is in free fall, in my view, because it has been unable to meet challenges, unable to brook dissent, and unable to see ordinary human inquiry as anything other than negative. In his book, Tactics, Gregory Kukul, who is an American Christian apologist, says this: if there is no discussion or argument within a church, here's what happens. First, there is no stop on errors arising, and I'll just throw out limbo and plenary indulgences right there. Second, there is no opportunity to learn how to argue in a reasonable way. And when there is no discussion, what you are left with, to use Kukul's words, is a contrived unanimity, which he says is shallow. This is why, in my view, the church faithful fell away like a deck of cards because of exactly that, a contrived unanimity, or in other words, an enforced show of agreement, which, as it turns out, was indeed shallow. The Catholic Church today has become associated with gender politics, sexual politics, exclusion, abuse, the misuse of power, the questionable behaviour of the CDF and the Curia, and so on. The maleness of Jesus has become pivotal to discussions about ministry rather than his actual ministry, or indeed the kind of ministry needed in the contemporary church. Mary T. Malone has described how female Christianity, which she has studied and researched in great depth for over 40 years, has been expressed especially in the writings of women such as Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, Hildegard of Bergen. Female Christianity, she says, is faith-based, not structural. I find this interesting because that structure, of course, does not include women. And that is because the structure as we have it is man-made and was designed by men for men. And as we now know from the reaction of the Catholic Church to any challenge, maintaining the structure and maintaining tradition with a capital T appears to be the primary consideration. But should it be the primary consideration? Because what struck me as I trawled through the material about the male-only celibate priesthood in the Catechism was the reliance on support from papal writings rather than from scripture. And it seemed to me that the priesthood as we see it today is not quite what I was seeing in the Bible. Rather, the early church seemed to me to be concerned with carrying out the ministry rather than with the status of who carried it out. A range of people, married, single, male and female, performed various tasks and roles. It seemed to me to be an inclusive and active church where teaching and living the gospel was paramount. So I wondered, was sitting passively in a pew for an hour every week while a priest performed the ritual of the Mass really what we are supposed to be doing? Of course, reading the Bible, studying the Word, and thinking about it for ourselves was not encouraged. But why shouldn't people ask questions or seek knowledge about the Scriptures? And where does someone who has questions and wants to discuss them go to do that? We should not be afraid to question, or indeed be questioned. Like many others, I had only ever read bits of the Bible. And I discovered from a study in America that less than 5% of people who identify as Christian have read the Bible. I also discovered that there are almost 30,000 strains of Christianity. So this certainly suggests that interpretation is indeed an issue. So you're not alone with your doubts or indeed your curiosity about particular interpretations of Scripture or indeed teachings that have been handed down by the Catholic Church. So when I finished writing my book, I decided to read the entire Bible. It took me a year, and I'm now on my second round. And I made a few interesting discoveries. And a very interesting one, given that most of us do have questions, is that we are supposed to be discerning. For instance, there are many examples, but I'll just read one. In the first letter of John, John writes, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world." Throughout the Bible, there are warnings again and again about false teachings and about false prophets. And my understanding of testing the spirits is that once you know Jesus and what he taught, by reading the Bible, you will be able to discern what fits in with what he says and what does not. I should point out that you will see no mention of limbo, nor will you see anything about plenary indulgences. And let me digress just a little and tell you what I discovered about limbo. And bear in mind what Kukul said. He said, "With no discussion, there is no stop on errors arising." Anyway, as most of you know, St. Augustine of Hippo theorized that all babies were born with the stain of original sin on their souls. If they died before being baptized, therefore, they were condemned to hell. However, Thomas Aquinas felt that because infants were not personally guilty and therefore not deserving of punishment, there must be another place for them besides hell. And to cut a long story short, the question could not be decided upon, so was left to one side. But limbo comes from the Latin word for margin, limbus. Somehow or another, the idea emerged that it was the unbaptized infants who were on the margins or in limbo, rather than the actual question itself. Although limbo was never defined as church dogma and was not mentioned in the revised 1992 edition of the Catechism, it has long been regarded as the common teaching of the Church. And many infants, as a result of this teaching, were denied burial in consecrated ground. And I don't like to even think about the anguish visited on parents for over 1,500 years by the implementation of this belief based on a misunderstanding. Anyway, in April 2007, the Vatican officially announced that there is a strong hope, rather than definite knowledge, that unbaptized babies are not excluded from heaven. The revision, it said, is based on a wider understanding of the mercy of God. Evolution does happen when it suits. So there you have a fixed tradition, quietly dismissed, and more to the point, revised, when, to use their words, a wider understanding is reached. So a fixed, unchanging tradition, I don't think so. And just to note, there is no infant baptism in the Bible either. So there is much to learn and much to think about. So what of the Catholic Church and its future? Well, perhaps the Catholic Church that has been found so wanting is not meant to continue as it is and has been. Perhaps a church that does not allow the laity, who are the church, to properly participate is no longer valid. And perhaps the growing number of groups of lay people who are meeting unofficially is what's supposed to happen. Perhaps the Catholic Church as we know it is not meant to be renewed. Perhaps these testing times are all about rebirth rather than renewal. Thank you.